The following is a video on the concepts of consumer and producer surplus. This video should help you a little bit, not only with the concepts, but how they're going to be presented in the APLIA assignment. So I recommend taking a look at this video and listening to it before starting those assignments. So the basic idea of the concepts of consumer and producer surplus are this. Going back to the last topic on supply and demand, we know that when we talk about demand, demand is the inverse relationship between price and quantity, right? The idea that as price goes up, quantity demanded falls, and as price goes down, quantity demanded rises, a movement along the demand curve. In the marketplace, right, it's the interaction of supply and demand, of consumers and producers, and their interaction which creates an equilibrium price, right? Markets don't exist unless there are benefits to both buyers and sellers in the marketplace. It doesn't mean that the benefits to buyers and sellers have to be equal. Buyers may benefit more than sellers, and sellers may benefit more than buyers in a particular market, depending again on the interactions of supply and demand. But once that market price is established, and at least temporarily, right, because we know that there are variables that can shift the supply and shift the demand function. But once that market price is established, let's say the market price that's established happens to be P1 in this example, that market price that's established is going to then ration the good to consumers based on those who are willing to pay for the product or who are willing to spend more than P1 to obtain the product, and those who are not, right? So the bottom of the demand curve, or that part of the demand curve below the price that's currently in the marketplace, which is down here, these individuals don't feel that the product is worth paying the price P1, and therefore they're not going to be in the marketplace. However, the individuals above that market price, and I'm just going to sort of darken up this and make it a little thicker, this part of the demand function, these are individuals who feel as though the product is worth paying the price P1. And in fact, for some individuals, let's say, for example, this individual right here, this individual might be saying that they're willing to pay a significant amount of money over the price P1 in order to obtain this product. So what we're seeing here on the demand line above the actual market price are all of the individuals who are willing to pay more than the actual market price, right? They would be going into a store or into a buying situation. They'd be expecting and be willing to pay a significant sum of money for this product, but happily they find out that they only have to pay price P1, and as a result they end up getting a significant amount of consumer surplus. So we can calculate that consumer surplus over, or in other words, the overall gains to consumers in this market at the price P1 by adding up how much gain there would be to consumers who would buy 1 unit, how much gain there would be to consumers who would buy 2 units, and so on, or the second unit and the third unit and the fourth unit. So we're seeing right here the difference between the price that consumers would be willing to pay and the actual market price. That is the amount of consumer surplus on the first unit. And then there's some consumer surplus on the second unit, and on the third unit, and on the fourth unit, and so on and so on and so on. There's even a tiny little bit of consumer surplus right here on that unit, and that amount of consumer surplus might only be a penny, maybe 2 pennies, right? But we need to add that up too. So we could sort of painstakingly add up the consumer surplus all the way through here from the first unit all the way out to Q1. Or what we can do instead and make it a little easier, given that this is a linear line, the demand function is a linear concept, then what we could do is we could use the area of a triangle 1/2 base times height as an estimate of that consumer surplus. So basically what we're doing is we're going to take the area of this triangle right here, and that's going to be our consumer surplus concept. In order to do that, we would need to know this price up here, which is the price, that the highest point on the demand curve, which is the price that's so high that nobody would be willing to buy the product, right? That's when P is some really high dollar value and consumption is 0. But once I know that dollar value, I can take that dollar value, subtract it from P1. That gives me the height of my triangle, because basically now I've got a triangle that's formed right here. And there's my right triangle. And then I got my base, which is Q1, and then I just multiply that by a half, 1/2 base times height. So consumer surplus is the area of a triangle, 1/2 base times height. Again, the concept is the benefits and gains to consumers in the marketplace. It's the concept of those who are willing to pay more than the actual going market price. So that's what they are in the market for, right? If the price of the product happened to go higher for whatever reason, maybe there's a shift in demand, maybe there's a shift in supply, and the overall market price ends up going a little bit higher, then obviously that triangle gets smaller. There's less surpluses or less gains to consumers if the price goes higher. If the price goes lower, there's more gains to consumers. It's pretty straightforward. When we think about the other side of the market, the fact that producers also benefit from being in a market and producing a product, then I'm going to go here and create my supply function. There we go. And when we think about the supply function, again, the supply function we can think of as indicating what price producers would need to get in the marketplace in order to provide a specific quantity. So again, the interaction of demand and supply in the market is going to generate an equilibrium price. And let's just say that that equilibrium price happens to be P1. If that equilibrium price happens to be P1, what the graph is telling us is that producers, if they were able to sell their product at price P1, would be willing then to put on the market, put out into the market Q1 units, meaning their quantity supplied would be Q1 if the price that they were getting for their product was P1. In that case, if they were getting exactly equal in price as to what they would need in order to provide the product, then they're not getting any benefit out of that, right? There's no extra coming out of that. However, there may be some sellers in the marketplace who might be able to produce certain quantities of the product at much lower prices. So for example, there might be a seller, and albeit there are not going to be too many sellers, who might be able to sell their price or sell their product for a really low price, like way down here on the supply function. If they were only getting that price, then they would only be able to produce a very small quantity, because remember that the price that they're getting in the marketplace for their product has got to cover the land, the labor, the capital, and the entrepreneurial skill, right, their inputs, in order to produce that product. So if they're getting a low price, they're not going to be able to produce very many units. However, if the actual market price for the product was P1, then those producers who are able to produce a few units of the product at pretty low prices would then be able to get surpluses by the difference between what the going price is, what the going price is, and what the minimum amount they would need to get is. So the difference between the price and the actual minimum amount that they would need in order to produce that particular quantity is the producer surplus on that quantity. So theoretically, based on the math of this graph, we can see that there's going to be producer surplus on the very first unit, where there might be a producer out there willing to make one unit at very low prices because they are only making one unit, so they don't need a lot in order to actually make that unit. But however, if they were able to sell that product at price P1, they would get a considerable amount of producer surplus. The second unit would require more labor and more capital, which means higher costs, which means they would need a higher price in order to actually produce the second unit. But again, because the actual going market price is much higher than what they need to get in order to make 2 units, the second unit, they're going to make producer surpluses on that unit as well. So there's some producer surplus there, there's some producer surplus there, and there, and there, and even all the way out to right here, right? On this last unit, that unit costs the firm a price that's just below price P1 to produce it. if they're able to sell it for price P1, then there's a tiny little bit of producer surplus still there in the marketplace. If we add all of that producer surplus up, we would then be calculating the overall gains to producers in this market, producer surplus. And again, instead of adding each one of those up for however many quantity units we have between 0 and Q1, what we can do to make it a lot easier is just take the area of that triangle 1/2 base times height. And so basically what we're doing is adding all of that up by just going, all right, producer surplus equals 1/2 base times height. Okay? So that's the concept of producer and consumer surplus. Again, with producer surplus, if the price happens to be higher for whatever reason, the producer surplus and the benefits to producers would be larger, and if the price were lower, then the benefits to producers would be smaller. Okay. In Aplia, the application of this concept is exactly the same, except in Aplia, they do not use supply and demand functions that sort of have that equation of a line linear concept. What they use are called step functions. And so they try to keep, and the idea here is that they're doing this to keep it a little simpler, but sometimes it can be confusing for students. And so in the examples that you'll see in Aplia, as you either create the graph in Aplia and then answer some questions, or you're given a graph in Aplia and then you're using that graph, what you'll see in Aplia is that you might get some information on what buyers of the particular product are willing to pay, and then you might get some data on what producers are willing to accept in order to produce the product. So you're going to find that there might be a buyer out there that's willing to pay an awful lot for that first unit, and that first unit, right, is sort of drawn out, or it looks as if it's a straight line across for that one unit. So you can sort of think of as this little line segment right here being one unit. And then there might be another buyer who's not willing to pay quite so much. They're willing to pay a little bit less than that. And so that second unit might only, the person might only be willing to pay that dollar amount. So let's just give this some context by putting some numbers in here. Let's say that the first buyer might be willing to pay $10, but the second buyer may only willing to pay $9. And so that $9 second buyer is that horizontal line. And then the third individual might only be willing to pay $8, and so on and so on and so on, right? So that's $8 right there for that particular quantity, and so on and so on and so on. On the other hand, we can look at what producers might be willing to accept in order to produce the product. And what they might be willing to accept, there might be a producer out there that's willing to accept a very small amount. So maybe they're willing to accept $1. And then the second producer has to and is willing to accept maybe $2, and so on and so on and so on. So you sort of start to see these step functions get created. Now my numbers are going to be a little off in this particular example because of my scale, but I think you get the idea here. And then this will keep going, boom, 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 like that. And then this will keep going, like that. So there's my, and this is my supply function right here. And given that information, we can then calculate producer and consumer surplus. Given that the equilibrium price in this particular example, where supply equals demand, right, is right here. I'll draw this line across. That's my equilibrium price. Let me just sort of edit this right there real quick so you can sort of see what this would look like if I did this correctly. Boom, boom, there we go. Okay. And then what we would need to do is we would just need to add up the consumer surplus and the producer surplus based on this market price. We'll call this market price P1, whatever it turns out to be. So what we're doing then is we're just taking the area, again, consumer surplus is how much people would be willing to pay over and above the market price. So we're taking the area under the demand line, which is the purple line here, under the demand line, but above P1. And so what I want to know is I want to add up what this box equals plus this box plus this box, plus this box, plus this box, plus this box, plus this box. So when I add all that up, and in this case, I wouldn't be using the equation of a triangle, the area of a triangle. I would just be adding up what each box is worth. Once I add all that up, I would have the consumer surplus. And then I do the same for the producer surplus. I'd have this box here, and this box, and this box, and boom, boom, this one, this one, this one, and this one. Add all that up, and I would have the producer surplus in this particular example. Okay, so what you're going to see in Applia is that you're going to be seeing these step functions, and that's really just a way of making it a little easier so you don't have to use the equation for the area of a triangle. But if we did have linear supply and demand functions, and you want to be able to do this, this could happen, this could come up on an exam. If you had linear supply and demand functions and the algebraic equations for these supply and demand functions, you want to be able to find the consumer and producer surplus. Okay, I believe that an example like this might also be part of the taxes chapter, so you might be able to see a little bit more of the algebra if you look at the video on algebra and taxes. Okay, so I hope this helps a little bit in terms of not only the concepts of consumer and producer surplus, but also doing the Applia assignment. And again, the reason that these concepts are important is that consumer and producer surplus allows us to estimate the overall gains to both consumers and producers in a market. It kind of tells us whether or not our markets are efficient or not. And if our markets are not efficient, there might be some waste or some inefficiency, what we call deadweight loss. And this is a concept that comes up in this topic as well. So by being able to measure these things and figure out how efficient the market is, it also allows us to tell us when the market is inefficient. And these are concepts that we'll use later on in the course when we start talking about monopoly, because monopolies are inherently inefficient and monopolies sort of lose some consumer and producer surplus. And it will allow us then to measure the monopoly in terms of whether or not society should regulate the monopoly because it is inherently inefficient. So we need these concepts in order to actually do that kind of calculation. I hope that helps, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me, and we can either set up a video chat or we can answer some questions via email. Thanks.